Well, today I want to talk about my favorite Christmas story of all time. And I know some of you are probably thinking that it just has to be either Luke or Matthew, in which case I'm sorry to disappoint you because we're talking today about Ebenezer Scrooge. The classic novel, A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. It's been made into something like 73 different movies and TV shows. I think just about every sitcom that there's been has done some kind of a takeoff on that for their Christmas special over the years. And everybody has their favorite version. And for me, there's no one single movie that gets all of the scenes of the dialogue quite right. Because I'm kind of a purist. I love the original book, and no one movie gets it all quite right. So for me, it's a combination of the 1954 black and white version, the one that stars Alistair Sim. Let's see, we have the 1984 version up there with George C. Scott, one of his last movies that he made. And then the one with Patrick Stewart, which is a very good one. But if you haven't read the book, or if you haven't read the book recently, I highly recommend it because Charles Dickens was a masterful writer. And in my humble opinion, there's no movie that can substitute for the power of the human imagination. And that's really what he was writing for back in those days, was to stimulate the imagination. And what I love about this story is that it's a transformation story. Someone starts out in the beginning of the story as this seemingly intransigent villain and is transformed into a genuine hero in the end. It's a message of hope, one of our Advent themes. It's a message of hope that says anyone can change, and I mean change radically at any time. No matter how bad things may look, no matter how bad someone looks, they can be turned around instantly. And I know that we've all experienced this. We've seen it happen, but we forget, don't we? Which is why we need these stories to remind us of the possibilities. This is a relatively short book, but in this relatively short book, we see the entire story of Scrooge's life, and it all starts out with that ghost of Christmas past. Shows Scrooge everything that had happened in his past, letting Scrooge know of all those things that he'd probably forgotten about that were responsible for the person he had become as an adult. You know, Scrooge started out the same as everyone else. An innocent child, got your entire life ahead of you, and then he saw all of the stuff from his past that he thought he had forgotten about. The stuff that was suppressed because it was too painful. Some of that shadow stuff that we've been talking about recently. Stuff that he tried to suppress that had now come back to haunt him, literally. He saw his own loneliness as a child when his parents left him at a boarding school at Christmas, where he was basically alone there. He saw his first employer. Remember old Fezziwig? It was a fellow who knew how to run a successful business and treat his employees well. He saw his first love, and then watched how his increasing obsession with money drove her away. He saw how he had pushed away his only living relative, pushed him out of his life, his nephew Fred, all because his beloved sister Fan had died giving birth to him. So each Christmas saw Scrooge withdrawing more from life and from human relationships, and slowly descending into his own private hell. And it was hell for Scrooge, and it was hell for anyone who was unfortunate enough to cross paths with him. Because you might recall that Scrooge wasn't just mean. He had this really cruel streak in him as well. He was the classic horse's rear end, as we might say. I mean, remember some of the rotten things that he used to say? He said if the poor and hungry would rather die than go live in the county poorhouse, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Or here's another little gem I think we have up here for you. He says, And he's talking to his nephew Fred, who comes by the office to visit, and Fred says, "Merry Christmas," and Scrooge goes off on this somewhat gleeful rant where he says, "What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer. If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart." I tell you, this man had some issues, didn't he? Today, we'd recommend a therapist, right? Get him some anger management, make him go watch Dr. Phil or something like that. Dr. Phil, is he still a thing?
Yes. Yeah.
He is?
Yes.
Okay, so I can use him as a punchline then, I guess. Very good. So, Scrooge basically saw other people in two ways. People who wanted something from him, and people from whom he could make a buck. That was it. He had no use for the poor, the homeless, or the oppressed. Those were the people that he would either despise or, more likely, he would ignore them. He didn't see them. And that was his real downfall. He could see, but he chose not to. The poor were all around him. In fact, that was one of the major themes of Dickens' writing. He was pointing out the social issues at the time. The poor were all around Scrooge, but he chose not to look at them. He chose not to acknowledge their existence. Scrooge had never really taken the time to get to know anyone. He had this employee, you might remember, a clerk by the name of Bob Cratchit. Bob had been working for him for years under rather harsh conditions. Scrooge had no idea after all those years that the Cratchits had this son that they called Tiny Tim, of course, who had a lot of health issues. As far as Scrooge was concerned, poverty and suffering didn't have a face. It was anonymous, and that was as good as being non-existent as far as he was concerned. So, now to the ghosts. My two favorite ghosts in the story are the Ghost of Christmas Present and Jacob Marley, because they really knew how to get all up in Scrooge's face and call him out for his hypocrisy. They really knew how to get under his skin. When the Ghost of Christmas Present comes around, Scrooge is forced to start confronting his cruelty and his indifference, and that's when the transformation begins. One of the things that the Ghost of Christmas Present does is finally introduces Scrooge to Tiny Tim. And Scrooge finally realizes how sick this child really was. So here's the exchange between Scrooge and the Spirit. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race," returned the ghost, "will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Using Scrooge's own words against him, which really was like a slap in the face. And the ghost goes on to say to Scrooge, "Keep your mouth shut until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is, because it may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." That got Scrooge's attention. Suffering and poverty now had a face, and it was the face of an innocent child. And when he saw that face, that's when he started to wake up. The transformation really got underway. Scrooge started to see that he could make a difference in the world if he were willing to reach out instead of withdraw. If he was willing to see rather than ignore. I mean, he could certainly make a difference in the life of this one child who he had chosen to ignore all of this time. So Scrooge starts putting the pieces together, and he realizes that he himself alone was responsible for what had happened to him, which means that he was going to have to be responsible for his own transformation. He knew the difference, as we say, between being a product of his past and a victim of his past. He knew what a precious gift it was to be able to see how his past and the choices that he had made had shaped his present reality. And he had no one to blame but himself. And he also realized that he could choose what he would become going forward. Now, I think this is a great book to reflect a lot of our unity message, because we teach that we're responsible for the way we experience life, and we are empowered to co-create and even recreate our lives. But first, we have to wake up. We have to be willing to see some things. We have to be willing to perhaps acknowledge some uncomfortable and unpleasant truths about ourselves, our past. And self-reflection is something that can keep us humble and lead to that transformation. So, Scrooge saw himself for the first time, really, and finally realized that his life was interconnected and intertwined with all of these other people in his life: Bob Cratchit, Tiny Tim, his nephew Fred, the poor, the homeless, the oppressed, all of those people that he had tried to ignore. One of the most powerful scenes, I think, is the last scene with the ghost of Christmas Present in it. The ghost shows him two children who are hiding under his great big robes. And there's a boy and a girl there who are described in the book as yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. I mean, Dickens had a way with words. And Scrooge asked the spirit, he says, "Whose children are they?" And the spirit goes on to say, "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." Scrooge says, "Have they no refuge or resource?" And the spirit throws his own words back at him once again. "Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?" The Spirit says to especially beware the boy. Ignorance. Ignorance as in being willfully unaware or refusing to see that which is in plain sight because it's too unpleasant. It's too uncomfortable. It doesn't conform to the party line or tribal dogma. That's the kind of ignorance that spells doom. Strong words, spoken by Charles Dickens in the mid-1800s. We get to decide how true they still are. Scrooge was a master at ignoring the obvious, and he did it by losing himself in his business. You stay busy enough, and you don't have to look at the poor or the hungry around you. At the beginning of the story, my other favorite ghost, Marley's ghost, appears. His old business partner appears to him. His business partner had died a year before on Christmas Eve. So Marley comes back, and Scrooge tries to compliment him by calling him a good man of business. He says, "Jacob, you were always a good man of business." And it was like throwing holy water on a vampire, to mix my metaphors here a little bit. When he says that, Marley cries out in a loud voice. He says, "Business? Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." Yeah. Don't mix up your job or your work with what is your business, because as Marley is pointing out, humankind was my business. It's kind of like back in the book of Genesis. Remember Cain and Abel? There's that great line in there. Cain kills Abel. God asks Cain, "Where is your brother?" And Cain says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Little bit of irony, a rhetorical question in there, maybe. Nice literary device. Even some sarcasm, maybe, right? I mean, what kind of question is that? Am I my brother's keeper? You know, a few thousand years later, Scrooge learned the answer to that question the hard way. The answer is yes, of course, I am my brother's keeper. And it took 3 ghosts to scare the snot out of him before Scrooge finally got it. Now, that's the sign, really, of an evolved consciousness. It doesn't matter how it happens, it just has to happen. That evolved consciousness, when we realize that we are our brothers and sisters' keeper. And I don't mean that in a codependent kind of way. It doesn't mean we're responsible for their happiness, but it does mean we start to lower the barriers of judgment and fear that keep us separate. Or the barriers of judgment and fear that we use as an excuse for not seeing what is right there in front of us. I think that's a big part of the positive message that we want to bring to the world. We don't have to look at the world as if it was a hostile place. We don't have to see it as a world where there might not be enough for ourselves, much less everyone else. It takes all of us, all of our resources coming together and looking at this message again and again and again. Maybe something as simple as talking about a ghost story like A Christmas Carol that can help us to be instruments of that kind of consciousness raising, that evolution. When's the last time anyone ever told you to be more like Ebenezer Scrooge? I mean, if you look at it this way, it's not such a bad thing, is it? As long as we get to that point where the transformation takes place. And again, really the best way to experience this story is to read the original, and I highly recommend that you try it this Christmas season. It's in the public domain. There's some good news. You can get a free PDF version online that you can read, and it's kind of fun to read it out loud too, because that was what it was, how it was meant to be used back in the day. It was read aloud. So at the end of the story, after Scrooge has gone through his transformation, he makes a promise. He says, "I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach." Now, that's a big promise, right? And isn't that the truth of what can happen sometimes? We get all caught up in the joy and the heat of the moment and a time of transformation. We get a bit over enthusiastic, and sometimes maybe we promise too much, right? It's like the child who desperately wants a puppy and promises that they'll walk it, they'll feed it, and that lasts about a week, and then here's mom taking care of the dog. So, how did Scrooge do on his promise? Did he deliver, or is mom walking the dog? Well, here's the way Dickens tells it. He said, "Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a friend as the old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world." Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter in the outset, and knowing that such as these would be blind anyway. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that truly be said of us and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone. See you next week.